The sky above Outpost Theta 7 turned from soft purple to angry orange as the first bombs fell from space. Elena Vasquez stood at the window of her small repair shop and watched the world she had called home for 3 years begin to burn. She was 63 years old now, her hair more gray than brown, her hands rough from decades of work and war. 30 years she had served in the Terran Marines before she retired and came here to live among the Volcari. The Volcari were tall beings covered in gray and brown fur, with faces like wolves and golden eyes that could see in the dark. They walked on 2 legs, like humans, but their bodies were built for hunting, and their culture was built around the pack. When Elena first arrived on this small farming moon, the Volcari had watched her with suspicion. A human living alone among them was strange, and they did not trust strangers easily. But Elena fixed their broken machines and never asked for more than fair payment. She learned their language and their customs, and slowly they began to accept her as a neighbor, if not quite as family. Now all of that was ending in fire and screaming and the thunder of Kreth, warships breaking through the atmosphere. The Kreth were insect creatures with hard shells and many legs and a hunger for slaves that had made them the terror of 3-star systems. Elena grabbed her old marine pistol from under her workbench and ran outside into the chaos. Volcari families were running toward the evacuation shuttles that waited. At the center of the colony, parents carried their pups in their arms, while soldiers tried to keep order and failed. Plasma fire streaked down from the sky, and buildings exploded into flame, and Elena ran with the crowd until she reached the main square where 5 large shuttles sat with their engines already warming. The first shuttle was full and lifting off before she could reach it. The second was boarding families with young pups and elderly members. First, Elena was about to join the line when she heard a sound that made her stop. It was a small cry, barely louder than the wind, coming from somewhere to her left. She turned and looked through the smoke and flames toward a collapsed transport shelter near the edge of the square. At first she saw nothing but burning metal and broken stone. Then she saw movement. A small figure was dragging itself across the ground away from the fire. It was a Volcari pup, gray-furred and thin, and his left leg was bent at an angle that made Elena's stomach turn. He was maybe 6 or 7 years old in human terms, still young enough to have soft fur and round features, and he was completely alone. Elena looked back at the evacuation shuttles. She could see Volcari adults running past the injured child without stopping. Some of them glanced at him and then looked away. Others did not even seem to notice he was there. The third shuttle sealed its doors and began to rise. Elena watched an adult Volcari male run right past the crawling pup without breaking stride. She felt something cold settle in her chest. "Hey!" she shouted at the running male. "There is a child over there." The Volcari did not stop or even look at her. Elena grabbed the arm of a female who was hurrying past with 2 pups clutched against her chest. "That child needs help," Elena said, pointing toward the collapsed shelter. The female looked where Elena pointed and her golden eyes went flat and empty. "That one has no pack," she said. "His parents died in the first strike, and no one has claimed him." "So what?" Elena demanded. "He is still a child." The female pulled free of Elena's grip. "He is nothing now," she said. "He belongs to no one, and no one will carry him, because to do so would make us responsible for him forever according to the old laws." She ran toward the 4th shuttle. Without looking back, Elena stood frozen for a moment as she tried to understand what she had just heard. The Volcari would leave a child to die because saving him would create an obligation they did not want. She looked at the injured pup again. He had stopped crawling. He lay curled on the ground with his arms wrapped around his broken leg and his eyes closed. He was not crying or calling for help anymore. He was just waiting to die. The 4th shuttle lifted off, and the 5th and final shuttle began its last boarding call. Elena could hear the pilot shouting for everyone to hurry, because the Kreth ground forces were almost here. She looked at the shuttle and then at the child. The shuttle meant safety and survival and a trip back to human space, where she could live out her remaining years in peace. The child meant danger and responsibility and probably death in the burning ruins of a colony that was already lost. Elena thought about all the years she had spent fighting in wars that seemed to have no end. She thought about all the people she had not been able to save and all the guilt she carried like stones in her chest. She thought about what kind of person she wanted to be when she finally faced whatever came after death. "Damn it all to hell," she muttered. And then she was running toward the fire instead of away from it. The heat hit her like a wall and the smoke filled her lungs and made her eyes water. She could hear the shuttle lifting off behind her, taking the last of the evacuees to safety. She did not look back. The pup saw her coming, and his golden eyes went wide with confusion. He tried to drag himself away from her, but his broken leg made him cry out in pain. Elena dropped to her knees beside him and reached out her hands. "Easy, kid," she said. "I'm not going to hurt you." The pup bared his small fangs and growled at her. "I know you are scared," Elena said, "but we need to move right now or we are both going to burn." She slid her arms under his small body and lifted him against her chest. The pup snarled and bit down hard on her. His fangs were small but sharp, and Elena felt blood begin to run down her arm. She did not drop him or cry out or pull away. She just stood up with him in her arms and started walking away from the flames. "You can bite me all you want," she told him, "but I'm not putting you down." The pup stared up at her with something like shock in his golden eyes. He had expected her to drop him when he bit her, because that was what any Valkyrie would have done. A bite was a sacred warning in their culture, and no one continued after receiving one. But this strange furless creature just kept walking with blood running down her arm and fire burning all around them. The pup stopped biting. He went limp in her arms and stared at her face, as if he was seeing something he did not understand. Elena carried him through the burning square and into the darkness beyond where the fires had not yet spread. Behind them, the colony collapsed into ash and ruin. Ahead of them lay only wilderness and danger and the slim hope of survival. But Elena had faced worse odds before, and she had never left anyone behind. She was not going to start now. The drainage tunnels beneath the colony were dark and wet and smelled like rotting plants. Elena moved through them with the injured pup pressed against her chest and her pistol in her free hand. She had discovered these tunnels 2 years ago when she was repairing irrigation equipment for a Valkyrie farmer. The Valkyrie engineers had dismissed them as primitive and useless, but Elena had mapped them anyway because old soldiers always looked for escape routes. Now that habit was keeping them alive. Above them, she could hear the heavy footsteps of Kreth, hunting parties searching the ruins for survivors. The insect creatures made clicking sounds when they communicated, and the noise echoed down through the ground like some terrible music. Elena held the pup tighter and kept moving. The pup had not spoken since she picked him up. He just lay in her arms and watched her with those wide golden eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 questions. His leg was badly broken, and she knew she would need to set it soon before infection took hold. But first they needed to get far away from the Kreth. They walked through the tunnels for hours until Elena's legs burned and her arms ached from carrying the child. Finally, she found a small chamber where the tunnel widened into a natural cave. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the air was cool and fresh. "We will rest here," Elena said as she set the pup down on a flat rock. The pup whimpered when his broken leg touched the stone. Elena knelt beside him and looked at the injury more closely. The bone was broken below the knee, and the leg was already swelling with fluid. "I need to set this," she told him. "It is going to hurt very badly, but if I do not do it, you might lose the leg." The pup stared at her. "Why are you helping me?" His voice was small and rough, like he had not used it in a long time. Elena pulled off her outer shirt and began tearing it into strips for bandages. "Because you needed help," she said. "But I am nothing." The pup said, I have no pack and no family and no honor left to give you in return." Elena paused and looked at his young face. She could see fear there and pain and something else that looked like shame. "What is your name, kid?" "Keth," the pup whispered. "But that name means nothing now because the ones who gave it to me are dead." Elena put her hand on his small furry head and felt him flinch at her touch. "Your name means something to me, Keth," she said. "And you are not nothing because you are. Right here, and you are alive, and that matters." Keth stared at her like she was speaking a language he had never heard. Elena picked up 2 straight pieces of metal from the tunnel floor to use as splints. "Bite down on this," she said, handing him a piece of cloth. "And try not to scream, because the Krath might hear us." Keth put the cloth in his mouth and closed his eyes. Elena took hold of his broken leg and pulled hard to set the bone. Back in place, Keth made a sound like a dying animal. But he did not scream. Tears ran down his furry face, and his small body shook with pain, but he stayed silent. Elena worked quickly to bind the splints against his leg with the strips of cloth. When she was finished, Keth lay on the stone panting and trembling. "You did good, kid," Elena said. That took courage. Keth opened his eyes and looked at her. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did." "Why?" Elena sat back against the cave wall and pulled out a protein bar from her pocket. She broke it in half and held one piece out to Keth. "Because a long time ago someone helped me when I needed it," she said. "And I promised myself that I would do the same for others when I got the chance." Keth took the food and sniffed it with suspicion. "It tastes terrible," Elena warned him, "but it will keep you alive." Keth bit into the bar, and his face twisted with disgust. Elena laughed softly. "I told you." They ate in silence while the distant sounds of Kreth search parties echoed above them. When they were finished, Elena checked her pistol and counted her remaining ammunition. She had 12 shots left and a 3-day walk ahead of them to reach the emergency beacon station on the far side of the moon. "Can you walk at all?" she asked. Keth, he tried to stand and immediately fell back with a cry of pain. "I will carry you then," Elena said. "We move when it gets dark." Keth looked at her with confusion. "You cannot carry me that far. Watch me." They rested through the heat of the day, and when darkness fell, Elena lifted Keth onto her back. He wrapped his thin arms around her neck and pressed his face against her shoulder. "Hold on tight," she said, "and tell me if you hear anything moving nearby, because your ears are better than mine." They moved through the tunnels for 3 more days. Elena carried Keth on her back until her spine screamed with pain, and then she carried him in her arms until her arms went numb. She fed him her last protein bars and gave him most of her water. At night, they slept in small caves with Keth curled against her side for warmth. On the second night, the Kreth came close. Elena heard them clicking in the tunnel ahead, and she pressed herself and Keth into a crack in the wall. The Elena heard them clicking in the tunnel ahead, and she pressed herself and Keth into a crack in the wall. Insects passed within 10 feet of their hiding place. Keth trembled against her, but he did not make a sound when the Kreth were gone. Elena let out a breath. She did not know she had been holding. "Good boy," she whispered. "You did perfect." Keth looked up at her in the darkness. "I was so scared." "So was I." "You were scared?" Keth sounded shocked. "But you are a warrior. Warriors get scared too," Elena said. "Being brave does not mean you have no fear, because being brave means you keep going even when you are afraid." Keth was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly, carefully, he pressed his small body closer against her side. Among the Valkyrie, this was a gesture of deep trust that was only given to family and pack members. Elena did not know the full meaning of what he was doing, but she felt something warm spread through her chest. She put her arm around him and held him close. "We are going to make it, kid," she said. "I promise." On the 3rd day, they reached the emergency beacon station. It was a small building on a hill overlooking a dead forest that had been burned by the initial attack. Elena carried Keth inside and laid him on a dusty cot. Then she activated the beacon and sent out a distress signal on all frequencies. Now, we wait, she told Keth. He looked up at her with eyes that had changed since she first found him. The fear and shame were still there, but now there was something else too. Trust hope, something that looked almost like love. Will someone come? He asked. Someone will come, Elena said. And when they do, I'm going to make sure you are safe. And then, what will happen to me? Elena sat down on the cot beside him and took his small hand in hers. I do not know yet, she admitted. But whatever happens, you are not going to face it alone, because I will be there with you. Keth squeezed her hand with his small fingers. I bit you, he said quietly. When you first picked me up, I bit you, and you still did not let me go. Elena looked at the bandage on her arm where his teeth had broken the skin. You were scared and hurt, she said. I do not hold that against you. Any Valkyrie would have dropped me after a bite. Keth said, it is our way to respect that warning and let go. I am not Valkyrie. Keth looked at her for a long moment. No, he said softly. You are something else entirely. He curled up against her side and closed his eyes within minutes. He was asleep with his small hand still holding hers. Elena sat in the darkness and listened to the beacon sending its signal out into the void. She did not know what the future would bring, but she knew one thing with perfect certainty. She was not going to let anyone take this child away from her. Not now, not ever. The Valkyrie warship broke through the clouds on the fourth day. Like a metal beast descending from heaven, Elena stood outside the beacon station and watched it land with Keth holding onto her hand. The ship was called the Fangs of Morning, and it was one of the finest vessels in the Valkyrie fleet. Its hull was dark gray and covered with weapons, and its engines made the ground shake as it touched down. A ramp lowered from the belly of the ship, and soldiers began marching out in perfect formation. They wore armor made of black metal and carried plasma rifles that hummed with deadly energy. At the front of the formation walked a tall Valkyrie male with silver streaks in his gray fur. His eyes were hard and cold, and his posture spoke of absolute authority. This was Commander Yorath, and Elena could tell from the way the other soldiers looked at him that he was not a being who accepted argument. Yorath stopped 10 feet away from Elena and looked at her with open contempt. You are the human, he said, the one called Vasquez. Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez. She replied, Terran Marines retired. Yorath snorted. Retired because your own kind had no more use for you, so you came here to live among us like some stray animal. Elena felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice calm. I came here to live in peace, and I paid my own way, and I never asked anything from your people except fair trade. And yet now you ask for rescue. I ask for nothing for myself, Elena said. That this child needs medical attention and safe transport off this moon. Yorath looked at Keth for the first time. The young pup pressed closer to Elena's leg, and his ears went flat against his head. I know that one, Yorath said. That is Keth's son of Vorath, and Mala, who died in the first bombardment. Then you know he is just a child who lost his family. I know he is clanless, Yorath said, and his voice dripped with scorn. His pack rights were severed when his parents died, and no one stepped forward to claim him. Elena felt Keth flinch at these words. He is without honor and without standing, Yorath continued. When we evacuated the colony, he should have been left to find his own death with dignity. He is a child, Elena said, and her voice rose with anger. He is 6 years old and alone and frightened, and you talk about letting him die with dignity. It is our way, Yorath said. The weak who cannot be carried by their pack must find their own path, even if that path leads to death. Because to carry one who is not pack is to make them pack, and no one wanted that burden. I carried him, Elena said. I found him in the fire, and I picked him up, and I carried him for 3 days, through the tunnels while your soldiers were running for the shuttles. Urath's eyes narrowed. You had no right to do that. He was dying. That was his fate to accept, not yours to change. Elena felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. It was the same feeling she got before a battle when she knew that talking was over and action was all that remained. I am taking him with me, she said. I am going to get him medical care, and I'm going to make sure he is safe, and there is nothing you can say that will change my mind. Urath took a step forward. You have no authority here, human. Then arrest me. The words hung in the air between them. The soldiers behind Urath shifted uncomfortably and exchanged glances. Elena stood her ground with her hands still holding Keth's and her eyes locked on the commander. You want to stop me, she said. Then you will have to take him from me by force, because I am not letting go. You would fight us? Urath asked, and there was surprise in his voice. One old human female against a full military unit. I have fought worse odds for things that mattered less. Urath stared at her for a long moment. Elena stared back without blinking. She was 63 years old and exhausted and burned and bleeding from a dozen small wounds. But her eyes held the same fire that had carried her through 30 years of war. You do not understand what you have done, Urath said finally. By carrying that child through fire and danger, you have invoked the old laws. I do not care about your laws. You should, because according to the ancient rite of Kethvara, you have made him your son. Elena blinked. What? The Kethvara is the flame-bearing, Urath explained. It is a ceremony from the oldest days of our people when pact bonds were forged through trial by fire. He began to pace back and forth in front of her. When a warrior carries an abandoned child through danger and feeds that child from their own supplies and tends to that child's wounds, they create a bond that cannot be broken. I did not know about any ceremony. Elena said, I just did what needed to be done. It does not matter if you knew, Urath said. The rite was performed and the bond was made, and according to our oldest laws, the child is now yours. Elena looked down at Keth. The young pup was staring up at her with wide golden eyes that held something like wonder. Mine, Elena repeated. Yours, Urath confirmed. To raise and protect and teach is your own because you carried him through. Fire and fire is the ultimate truth. But I am human. Yes, and that will make things complicated, Urath admitted. There are those among my people who will say that a human cannot perform Kethvara because the rite was meant for Valkyrie alone. What do you say? Urath was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, and some of the contempt had faded from his eyes. I say that I watched you stand before me without fear and declare that you would fight my entire unit rather than give up a child you have no blood connection to. He looked at Keth, and something flickered across his face. My own people ran past this boy while he lay dying, and not one of them stopped because not one of them wanted the burden. He is not a burden. No, Urath agreed. He is not because you saw something worth saving when everyone else saw only a problem to be abandoned. He turned to his soldiers. Take them both to the medical bay and treat the child's injuries, and treat the human's wounds as well. Commander, one of the soldiers spoke up. The traditionalists will not accept this. The traditionalists can file their complaints through proper channels. Urath said, for now this human has claimed responsibility, according to the oldest laws we have, and I will not be the one to stand in the way of that. He looked back at Elena one more time. You have a hard road ahead of you, Sergeant Major. I have walked hard roads before. This one will be different, because you are not just fighting for survival anymore. He nodded toward Keth. You are fighting for a future that does not belong to you. Elena squeezed Keth's hand and felt him squeeze back. Every future I have ever fought for belonged to someone else, she said. That is what soldiers do. Urath studied her for another long moment. Then, slowly he inclined his head, what might have been respect. Take them inside, he ordered his soldiers, and treat them well because whatever else she may be, this human has earned that much. As the soldiers led them up the ramp into the ship, Keth pulled on Elena's hand. "Did he say I am yours now?" he asked in a small voice. Elena knelt down to look him in the eyes. "Yes, he did. And you will not give me away. Never. Even though I am not human, and I bet you have no honor left." Elena pulled him into her arms and held him tight. "Listen to me, Keth," she said. "I do not care what their laws say about honor, and I do not care what anyone thinks about what you are worth." She pulled back to look at his face. "You are my kid now, and that means I will fight for you and protect you and love you until the stars go dark, because that is what family means." Keth stared at her with tears running down his furry face. Then he threw his small arms around her neck and buried his face against her shoulder. "Mother," he whispered. It was the first time he had called her that Elena held him close and let her own tears fall. "Yes, baby," she said. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." Around them, the Valkyrie soldiers watched in silence. Some of them looked uncomfortable, and some looked confused, but a few of them looked at the old human woman holding the orphan pup and saw something that made them reconsider everything they thought they knew about honor and family and love. The ramp closed behind them, and the ship began to rise. Below them, the burned ruins of Theta 7 faded into the distance. Ahead of them lay uncertainty and challenge and 1,000 battles yet to be fought. But Elena had her son in her arms and her purpose clear in her heart, and that was enough. The legal battle for Keth lasted 2 years and 3 months. Elena fought it in Valkyrie courts and human courts and joint tribunals that had never existed before her case forced them into being. The traditionalists among the Valkyrie said that of human could not perform Kethvara because the right was sacred to their people and not meant for outsiders. The progressives argued that the ancient laws predated any concept of species and that the fire did not care who carried whom through it. Elena simply refused to let Keth go. Every time a court ordered her to surrender him, she appealed. Every time an official came to take him, she stood in the doorway and told them they would have to arrest her first. The media on both worlds became fascinated by the story of the old human soldier and the orphaned wolf child. Elena hated the attention, but she used it when she could to put pressure on the officials who wanted to separate them. Finally, after 27 months of fighting, the High Council of Valkar issued its ruling. The Kethvara was valid. Elena Vasquez was legally recognized as Keth's mother under both Valkyrie and Terran law. When the decision was announced, Elena was sitting in a small apartment on Earth where she had been living with Keth while the case dragged on. Keth was 8 years old now, and his leg had healed, though he still walked with a slight limp. He was sitting on the floor playing with a puzzle toy when Elena's communicator buzzed with the news. She read the message 3 times to make sure she understood it. Then she looked at Keth and felt tears begin to run down her face. "What is wrong?" Keth asked with worry in his golden eyes. "Did something bad happen?" "No, baby," Elena said. "Something good happened and we won." "Won what?" "Everything," Elena said. "You are officially my son, and no one can ever take you away from me." Keth stared at her for a moment. Then he let out a howl of joy that made the neighbors bang on the walls. Elena laughed and pulled him into her arms, and they held each other while the reality of their victory sank in. They moved to Montana 2 weeks later. Elena had grown up in those mountains, and she wanted Keth to know the land that had shaped her. She bought a small house near a river where the water ran cold and clear over smooth stones. The mountains in the distance reminded Keth of the ridgelines on Theta 7, and he would sometimes sit on the porch and stare at them for hours. Elena taught him to fish in the human way with a rod and line and patience. Keth taught her to howl at the moons the way his people did. When they wanted to speak to the spirits of the dead, they built a life together in that small house year by year and memory by memory. Elena helped Keth through physical therapy for his leg, even when the exercises hurt and he wanted to give up. Keth helped Elena through the nightmares that came from 30 years of war, even when she woke up screaming and could not remember where. He would crawl into her bed on those nights and press his warm, furry body against her side. "I am here, Mother," he would whisper. "You are safe now." Elena would hold him close and breathe in the scent of his fur until her heart stopped racing. "I know, baby," she would say, "I know." When Keth was 12, a Valkyrie diplomatic delegation came to visit. The ambassador was a female named Sora, who had argued in favor of Elena's case during the legal battle. She came with 2 aides and a gift of traditional Valkyrie clothing for Keth. Elena watched from the kitchen as Keth greeted them at the door. He was nervous. She could tell from the way his ears kept twitching. He had not spent time with other Valkyries since leaving the warship years ago, and he was not sure how to behave. But when the delegation entered the house, Keth straightened his spine and lifted his chin. "I am Keth," he said in the formal Valkyrie speech that Elena had helped him practice for weeks. "Son of Elena Vasquez, and I bear her name and her honor." Ambassador Sora's eyes went wide. "You speak the old words," she said. "My mother taught them to me," Keth replied. "She said if I was going to be her son, I should understand what that meant to my people." He glanced back at Elena and a small smile crossed his face. And then she said, "It did not matter what anyone else thought because I was her kid, and that was that." Sora was silent for a long moment. Then she bowed deeply, a gesture of respect that Elena had never seen a Valkyrie give to anyone outside their own species. "Your mother," Sora said softly, "is a remarkable being." The visit lasted 3 days. Sora told Keth stories about Valkyrie history and culture that Elena could never have taught him. She explained the meaning of the Kethvara in detail, how it was once the most sacred bond a warrior could form, and how it had fallen out of practice as Valkyrie society became more concerned with bloodlines and formal adoption. "Your mother did not know any of this," Sora said. "She did not perform the rite because she wanted to claim you according to our laws." "Then, why did she do it?" Keth asked. "Because she saw a child who needed help, and she could not walk away," Sora said. "That is something rarer and more precious than any ritual." On the last night of the visit, Sora spoke to Elena alone while Keth was sleeping. "You have done something remarkable," the ambassador said. "You have raised a Valkyrie child with love and respect for both his heritage and yours." "I just tried to be a good mother," Elena said. "You succeeded," Sora said. "But I must warn you that there are still those among my people who resent what you have done, and there are those who will try to use Keth for their own purposes as he grows older. Let them try," Elena said, and her voice was hard. "Anyone who wants to hurt my son will have to go through me first." Sora smiled. "I believe you mean that. I have never meant anything more in my life." The ambassador nodded. "Then I will do what I can to protect you both from my end, because what you have built here is worth protecting." She looked out the window at the mountains in the moonlight. "You know the Valkyrie have a saying about humans." "I have heard a few," Elena said dryly. "This one is from the old times before we ever met your kind in person, when we only knew you from stories passed down through generations." Sora turned to face her. "We called you the stubborn ones because you refused to die when the universe demanded it, and you refused to stop fighting when all hope was lost." She put her hand on Elena's shoulder. "Now, I understand why, and it is not because you are too foolish to know when you are beaten. Then, why? Because you love too deeply to let go," Sora said. "Even when holding on tears you apart." Elena thought about Keth sleeping in the next room. She thought about all the battles she had fought to keep him, and all the battles still to come. "Yes," she said quietly. "I suppose that is true." "It is not a weakness," Sora said. "It is the source of your greatest strength, and it is why a retired human soldier could accomplish what none of my own people were brave enough to attempt." She squeezed Elena's shoulder. "Take care of your son, Sergeant Major," and let him take care of you in return because you have both earned that much. Elena watched the delegation leave the next morning. Keth stood beside her on the porch, waving until the transport disappeared over the mountains. Mother, he said. Yes, baby. Thank you for teaching me the old words. Elena put her arm around his shoulders. Thank you for learning them. And thank you for carrying me through the fire. Elena pulled him close. I would do it again, she said. 1,000 times if I had to. Keth leaned his head against her side. I know, he said. That is what makes you my mother. They stood together on the porch and watched the sun rise over the mountains, somewhere out. There among the stars, the Kreth were still raiding and killing and taking slaves. Somewhere out there, the universe was still cruel and cold and indifferent to the suffering of the small. But here in this moment, there was warmth and love and a family that nothing could break, and that was enough. For now, that was everything. 20 years after the fall of Theta 7, the Kreth returned. This time they came for Earth Lieutenant Commander Keth Vasquez. Stood on the bridge of the TSS Montana and watched the enemy fleet emerge from jump space like a swarm of metal insects. He was tall now with gray fur marked by a single white streak that ran from his forehead to his neck. His golden eyes were calm and steady. As he studied the tactical display behind him, his crew waited for orders. They were a mixed group of humans and Valkyrie and half a dozen other species who had joined the Terran Alliance over the past 2 decades. The Montana was the first fully integrated command in the fleet, a symbol of everything the Alliance had become, and now it stood in the path of the largest Kreth invasion force anyone had ever seen. Commander, his tactical officer called out. Enemy fleet is 247 ships and counting. Keth nodded slowly. The Allied Defense Flotilla numbered 32 vessels. The math was not in their favor. What are their demands? He asked. Unconditional surrender, the communications officer reported. They say resistance is futile, and we should accept our fate with dignity. A bitter smile crossed Keth's face. He had heard those words before in stories about his own people, and how they had left him to die. Signal the fleet, he said. All ships prepare for attack pattern Vasquez 7. His first officer, a human woman named Chun, turned to look at him with surprise. Sir, that pattern is designed for fighting through an enemy formation, not for winning an engagement. I know what it is designed for, Keth said. We are not trying to win because we cannot win against those numbers. He looked at the view screen, where tiny civilian transport ships were racing away from Earth toward the safety of deep space. We are trying to buy time for the evacuation. Chun followed his gaze, and understanding dawned on her face. How long do we need to hold them? She asked. Long enough, Keth said. However long that takes. He reached up and touched the pendant that hung around his neck. It was a small disc of melted metal, pressed flat by human hands decades ago. His mother had made it from a piece of the drainage tunnel where they had hidden on Theta 7. She had given it to him on the day he graduated from the Naval Academy. Remember where you came from, she had told him, and remember what it means to carry someone through the fire. He had worn it every day since all hands, Keth announced over the shipwide channel. This is your commander speaking. His voice was steady and strong, and it carried the weight of everything his mother had taught him. The Kreth want us to surrender, and they want us to accept our fate with dignity, but I have a different idea. He paused and looked around the bridge at the faces of his crew. Out there right now are civilian ships full of families running for their lives, and those families are counting on us to give them the time they need to escape. He stood straighter, and his voice rose. 20 years ago, my mother carried me through fire when everyone else said I should be left to die, and she did not do it because she thought she would win, but she did it because it was right. His hand closed around the metal pendant. Today, we carry them through fire, and we do not stop until every last civilian ship is safe, because that is what it means to be family. He looked at the view screen where the Kreth fleet was forming into attack formation. And make no mistake, every single person on those evacuation ships is family. The bridge was silent for a moment. Then Chun spoke quietly. "Orders, Commander. All ships engage," Keth said. "And may whatever gods are listening have mercy on anyone who gets in our way." The battle lasted 9 hours. The Montana took hit after hit, but Keth held his position in the formation. Every time a gap opened in the Kreth lines, he sent civilian ships racing through to safety. His shields failed in the 4th hour, and his weapon systems began to overload in the 6th. But still, he fought on. By the 8th hour, only 7 Allied ships remained functional. The Montana was bleeding fire from a dozen hull breaches, and half her crew had been evacuated to other vessels. But the evacuation was nearly complete. "Commander," Chum reported, "the last civilian convoy is clear, and they are jumping to safety now." Keth slumped back in his chair and allowed himself a moment of relief. Then the ship shook with another impact, and alarms began screaming across the bridge. "Hull breach on Deck 7, someone shouted. "Engineering is reporting critical damage to the reactor containment." "How long do we have?" Keth asked. 10 minutes, maybe less." Keth closed his eyes. He thought about his mother sitting on the porch of their house in Montana, watching the sun rise over the mountains. He thought about all the lessons she had taught him about courage and sacrifice and love. He thought about what she would do in his place. "All hands abandon ship," he ordered. "Everyone to the escape pods immediately." The crew began to move toward the exits. Chun grabbed his arm. "You too, Commander. I will be right behind you," he said. "Someone needs to keep the ship on course. Keth, please." He looked at her and smiled. "Get to the pod, Sarah, and that is an order." She stared at him for a long moment with tears in her eyes. Then she saluted and ran for the exit. Keth turned back to the view screen. The Kreth flagship was directly ahead, massive and bristling with weapons. If he could hit it hard enough, he might disable their command structure and give the rest of the fleet a chance. He pushed the engines to maximum and aimed straight for the heart of the enemy. "Mother," he whispered, "I hope I made you proud." The Montana struck the Kreth flagship at full speed. The explosion lit up the void like a newborn star. When the light faded, the flagship was broken and burning, and the Kreth formation was scattering in confusion. The remaining Allied ships pressed their advantage, and within hours the enemy was in full retreat. Earth was saved. 3 days later, a rescue ship found Keth's escape pod drifting in the debris field. He was unconscious and badly wounded, but alive. His first officer had dragged him to the pod and launched it seconds before the collision. She had not told him she was doing it because she knew he would have ordered her to stop. Elena met the rescue shuttle on the tarmac of the Montana spaceport. She was 83 years old now, and she walked with a cane, but her eyes were still fierce and bright. When the shuttle doors opened and Keth limped down the ramp, she dropped her cane and ran to meet him. He caught her in his arms and held her tight. "You impossible boy," she whispered. "You absolute impossible boy." "I learned from the best," he said. Around them, the crews of a dozen ships watched in silence, humans and Valkyrie and others, all of them alive because one hybrid family had shown them what the fire bond truly meant. Not species and not blood and not politics or protocol, just a simple truth that a retired Marine had known all along. You do not leave anyone behind. Not ever. Not for any reason. The Valkyrie called it Kathvora. The humans called it something simpler. They called it love. Elena pulled back to look at her son's face. He was injured and exhausted, and he bore scars that would never fully heal. But he was alive and he was here, and that was all that mattered. "Come on, baby," she said, taking his hand. "Let us go home." Keth smiled and let her lead him away from the shuttle. Behind them, the sun was setting over the mountains that had been their home for 20 years. Ahead of them lay rest and recovery, and a future that had been bought with sacrifice and courage. But none of that mattered in this moment. In this moment, There was only a mother and her son walking hand in hand toward the light, and that was enough. That was everything. That was the whole point all along.